All of you know what it's like to start out on a pretty scary venture, a new endeavor. You're not really sure what the outcome is going to be. It could be the time when you started a new job or you moved to a new community. Um, you bought the hair season tickets. It could be the time when you walked your daughter down the aisle at her wedding or you dropped your son off at college. Whatever the case may be, we all know what it's like to begin a new endeavor, and we don't know how well the outcome is going to be. Imagine that you come from a community where everybody in the community had been slaves for 400 years. All you've known is slavery. All your parents and grandparents have known is slavery. Your neighbors. All of you were slaves for 400 years. That's a whole lot of generations. You don't know what it's like to be an autonomous person because someone else has always owned you. You don't know what it's like to be a citizen because citizens are not property and you've always been property. Now imagine one day out of the blue there's a man who comes along and he tells you that God told him that you don't have to be a slave anymore. And not only that, but you can now be a citizen. You can be a citizen in your own land, far and away from there. Freedom is not something it's not a concept that you've even really had considered before. You just know that you don't like your circumstances right then. You know, there's a fundamental difference between slavery and freedom that very few people ever think about. Slavery, believe it or not, is actually fairly safe. It's actually a fairly safe existence. For one thing, the people who enslave you have a vested interest in your survival, don't they? You know, you're not any good to them unless you're alive and unless you're healthy. So in slavery, you are provided for to a certain extent. Also, slavery is fairly predictable. There is a routine to it. In slavery, under that system, when you're a slave, there are certain things that you can at least count on. Plus, you're not really responsible for anything. You're responsible only for obeying your master. That's slavery. Freedom, believe it or not, is actually pretty scary. As Americans, we're conditioned to say freedom, that's a great thing. But freedom is actually very scary, and it's actually very unpredictable. Because now, you're the one calling the shots. You're the one who has self-determination. You don't have someone else calling the shots for you. Yes, you can have voluntary associations, but you're the ones calling the shots. And because you are largely in charge of your own destiny, anything can happen. Freedom is a lot less predictable than slavery, and as a result, too, freedom requires a lot harder work to keep and exposing oneself to danger to keep. That's one of the differences between slavery and freedom. The people of Israel had had enough of slavery. Maybe things were secure, but the Egyptians were not particularly good to them, and they wanted to be self-determining. They wanted to have their own nation. They wanted to have the freedom to worship God as they chose. And so Moses led them. Scholars estimate that there were 2.4 million people in the Exodus that were led out of Egypt. If you can even imagine that, they didn't have microphones either. So I guess if they did it, we can do that here. 2.4 million. That's the story of the Exodus. I can't even imagine 2.4 million people, but that's what was led out of Egypt. And we know the story that God went before the people of Israel and said, I will lead you out of there. Follow my servant Moses, but basically we know God is in charge. And God is in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And the people of Israel can all see that pillar. They're told that God's presence is in that pillar. It, in and of itself, is symbolic that God is always with them and God is there to provide for them and to protect them. And so they're going out of Egypt. What a sight this must have been. I've often wondered what that pillar of cloud looked like. I think a movie showed it to be like an F3 tornado, something like that. That would certainly keep the Egyptians away. But Pharaoh, when he saw that his free labor was getting away, he sent the Egyptian army after them. And so even though they were following God and God said, I'm going to take care of you, they still had that level of uncertainty. So you know how the story went is that pillar of cloud and that pillar of fire that God was in went behind the column this time, was in front of it, but now went behind the column and got in between the people of Israel and the army of Egypt. And now they're facing nothing other than the Red Sea. With the Egyptian army behind them, even though God is still standing in that gap, and the Red Sea in front of them, they are now facing what is not proverbial, but a real between a rock and a hard place. Have you ever found yourself in between two very conflicting situations? Have you found yourself in between a rock and a hard place? Of course you have. Anybody who's old enough to vote has had that. And all of you have faced that numerous times. This is what's going on with the people of Israel. And they're told to trust. But what does God say to them even in the midst of this dilemma? He says, start walking. Start walking. The Red Sea is in front of them. And they don't even have so much as a canoe to their name. No way of getting across. That's what it's like facing an uncertain future. We're not really sure how we're going to do it, but God says, start walking. And they do. And we've seen the movies, we've heard the story, there's pictures of it in Sunday school. God parts the Red Sea, causes the people of Israel to pass through on dry land, and then he doesn't allow the Egyptian army passage. I know some people don't like that, think it's harsh, but that's what the scriptures record. The question for us, as we're emerging from a pandemic, maybe the word emerging, because it's a process. We don't know how long this is going to last, but we see signs here and there that we're trying to move forward, and I think the country and the world is inching forward, and as a congregation, we too are inching forward out of this. A pandemic is not exactly bondage, but I'll tell you, it sure felt like it to me, and still does. We have an uncertain future in front of us, and it probably feels to us like we're looking at the Red Sea. Maybe for you, in your individual circumstances or in your family circumstances, it feels like you're looking at the Red Sea. Let me tell you something. The God that you and I worship every Sunday morning, the God that you and I talk about every Sunday morning, is the same exact God that was in the pillar of cloud and fire and led the people out of Egypt. It is not an offspring of that God. It is not a facsimile of that God. It is the very same exact Yahweh, Adonai, Jehovah I Am, Elohim, same exact God. The question for you and for me this day, this rally day, is, do we believe that God today can still part waters the way he did then? Do we believe in the power of Almighty God, that God can still cause us to walk on dry land? I can't tell you what you have to believe. That's a question that you and I can only ask for ourselves and answer for ourselves as we begin this fall season. But it's the question that we begin with. Do you believe in the power of God to part whatever is in front of you? I think we will emerge from this okay, if we're following the same God that Moses and the people of Israel followed. Maybe we don't have a pillar of cloud and fire to look at, but God is just as alive today as he was then. Amen.